Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This video is a short discussion of time and the representation of time in the history of the novel. So there's basically two ways of thinking about time and how it comes into play in literature in general. There's first of all, we can think about narrative time, and then we can think about story time. So I'll try to explain that distinction. So the narrative time is the the time it takes to tell the story, so to speak. So the time of the telling, and then the story time is the time represented, the time of the events represented in the story. So to give an example, if I were to tell a story that goes something like, I always give this type of story when I'm trying to describe this to my university classes. So the story goes, a young couple, they meet when they're around 18, they fall in love. It's a it's love at first sight. They fall in love, they get married, they have kids. The kids are are well brought up, they're successful, they move away. The couple grow old together and love the whole time, and eventually die of old age when they're both 88 years old. So, in that story, not a very action packed story, I have to admit, but the telling of the story, the narrative time is maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds a minute, whereas the story time was about 70 years, if I recall correctly, the ages I gave there, 18 to 88. So the story time covered, the events that were covered in the story was about 70 years. The narrative time very compressed. A lot of story events compressed into a short amount of narrative time. So what we see here on this slide is an example of what we could call as the compression or the condensation of story time throughout the history of the novel. So novels have generally gotten shorter, but so the narrative time is compressed a little bit, but even in longer modern novels, what we see is the severe compression of story time, the time, the scope of events that will be represented in the novel. So this is brought to light by, for my money, one of the best contemporary quantitative or digital studies of literature that have come out recently, Ted Underwood. So you can see the citation on the side. It's an article called "Why Literary Time is Measured in Minutes." So he and his team took dozens and dozens of novels throughout the history of the novel and took a systematic approach of taking about one page, 250 words of narration. So the narrative time is consistent, and taking samples from, they took several samples from novels throughout that history, and then tried to record about how much story time is represented in that one page or so of narration. And as you can see, where we start from the left, maybe the first real novel, Robinson Crusoe, on average, around one page of narration is going to represent 4.5 days or almost a week. And by the time we get to the modernist novel on the right, so good example, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf represents about 6 minutes per page. So with the modernist novel, we have focus on stream of consciousness rather than actions in the real world. The novel is focusing to a high degree on the thoughts of the characters, and very little, let's say, story or actions are taking place in the real world. A couple things to note, that the vertical axis is a logarithmic scale. So although the decrease is noticeable, if you keep in mind the logarithmic scale, it's even more pronounced. So there's about 100-fold compression from going from days on the in the beginning 1719 to minutes in the on the right hand side of the graph. So it's a landmark study in a couple of ways. First of all, scholars had noticed that modernist authors, so the beginning of the 20th century or so, had focused on this stream of consciousness, and people had noticed that obviously Ulysses, James Joyce's landmark novel, as well as Mrs. Dalloway, which I just mentioned, both take place in one day. So people said, boy, the novel's really focusing on a short amount of time. But previously, people had thought this was a sharp break from tradition. People had thought that it was pretty normal and pretty flat trajectory if you were to measure it, if you were able to measure it. And then all of a sudden, there was a real focus in the early 20th century on short amount of time and on inner reflections. However, what we see with the Underwood study is that there has been this gradual and progressive concentration and focusing on a narrower and narrower range of actions, and the actions have become increasingly, say, short in duration, increasingly focused on the self, as I said, and the scope of meaning, the scope for drawing meaningful connections. And this is where I'm putting in my own interpretive, let's say, interpretive explanation for this. The Underwood study doesn't offer an explanation of why this is happening, but for my money, what is happening is that we're not able to draw grand narratives anymore. You think to any, well, the whole epic tradition is about trying to see our actions within the scope of the unfolding of the whole cosmos. And then at the beginning of the novel, at least you can think about your actions within the scope of trying to make your way on a deserted island over 30 years, right? So that's Robinson Crusoe. So he's going to tell you about his actions and his plans, and maybe a page is going to tell you about those plans that happened over a week. Whereas the scope for being able to gather together the disparate phenomena of time and of existence into a meaningful whole is really narrowed as modernity has progressed through its successive phases. And by the time we get to the 20th century, the 21st century, it is really narrowed down to the self, the thoughts of the self as they pass by in fleeting minutes. Um, just a last point on the method. So traditionalists might, let's say, scoff at the method undertaken for the Underwood study. So it's a quantitative study. It's not technically a digital humanities study in that it doesn't require large scale mining of digitized texts. It can be done without that. And so the team just applied a quantitative analysis to these texts. So traditionalists would say, okay, well, the humanities are about trying to find meaningful connections within our lives, how we articulate meaning, and that involves something beyond mere quantity. Now, the digital humanists would say that's where we need to go. The quantitative approach, or an increasingly quantitative approach, is where we need to go, and that's, let's say, the future of the humanities. I think I find myself somewhere in the middle. I'm a traditionalist in the sense that I think the humanities are about studying how humans articulate meaning, and that means being able to see how we find parts and gather them into a whole. And a strictly quantitative study isn't going to help us do that unless we can take the parts, the quantities, and somehow bring them back together again. But I do think there is a value in quantitative evidence if it can supplement what we're trying to say with more qualitative studies. So I'm going to end there and this discussion of time in the history of the novel. I hope you found it as interesting as I have in terms of your study of novels anywhere along this trajectory. I always think it's insightful. So thank you very much.